One of the most distinguished men I have ever known.
Ethiopian policy under Haile Selassie has always been directed first of all toward education and secondly toward modernization. Since his restoration in 1941, he put Canadian officials in the key ministries of finance and commerce. In education, more than 20% of Ethiopia's teachers are from Canada.
People in Ethiopia are then aware of Canada.
Yes, Ethiopians know quite a bit about Canada. It is the first country we brought teachers from. There are still Canadian teachers in Ethiopia, and I hope we are going to get more Canadian teachers into Ethiopia in the near future.
Mr. Robert Thompson of the Social Credit Party in Canada was a teacher in Ethiopia. Mr. Thompson, you spent many years in Ethiopia. What was the occasion of your going there in the first place?
Well, in 1943, following the defeat of the fascists in Ethiopia, there was no rehabilitation program available to that country, such as there was later for Italy, for Holland, for Denmark, for Norway. And consequently, anything that was done from the outside was done on a quasi-official or an unofficial basis. As a result, the Emperor Haile Selassie sent out a call to friends of his that he had known in Bath during the exile or prior to the takeover by the fascists, asking for volunteers, doctors, nurses, and teachers. At that time, I had two connections who were friends of the Emperor. One was my padre in the RAF in Canada, Wing Commander Gregson. The other was Dr. R.V. Bingham in Toronto, who was head of the Sudan Interior Mission. When they heard or when they received word from the Emperor in regard to the need for technical help and rehabilitation services, they came to me and suggested 1943 to Ethiopia. In the first instance, I served in the first secondary school as vice principal, then went on into the Ethiopian Air Force for the duration, then back into secondary education, and later on into administration, where I served in a position which would be equivalent here to deputy minister.
You actually fought on the side of Ethiopia during the war?
Well, no, not exactly in that way. We were instrumental in setting up the first training.
Responsible for the education of the Emperor's children?
Well, I was responsible for the placing of students in foreign universities, many of whom came to Canada. We also were responsible for setting up some of the schools in Ethiopia, and thus a number of the royal family, as well as many hundreds of other Ethiopians, came into our hands, yes.
You must have, during your time in Ethiopia, got to know the Emperor very well.
Well, the Emperor retained, up until just recently, the post of Minister of Education. He had a vice minister who actually carried on the day-to-day administration, but the Emperor reserved the office for himself. And consequently, for at least 6 years, he was my direct boss, so to speak. I had a telephone line to his palace, to his office as well, and we were in constant connection with him, not only in regard to developing education, but to many foreign assignments that I was sent on during these years.
During my brief meeting with him, I found him to be a very human sort of person.
This trip has been a real privilege for me because I have eaten my meals with him on the Royal Train, and I have spent at least 3-4 hours in consultation about world issues, about the Canadian scene, and about the developing situation in Ethiopia. And so I could only agree with you entirely that he is truly one of the great statesmen of the world.
I remember back in 1936 when he appeared before the League of Nations. I was quite young at that time, but I remember shedding more than one tear for the Emperor.
I, too, was very interested in that time, and I suppose when the opportunity came to go to Ethiopia that this was part of the background of it, because you will recall that the Japanese had invaded China at the same time. And I can recall as a high school student and then later as a young teacher my own concern about the Japanese invasion of China and the fascist invasion of Ethiopia.
Despite the Emperor's efforts to promote education and modernize the country, there were genuine grievances in Ethiopia. In December 1960, during the absence of the Emperor in Brazil, a coup d'etat was attempted by senior officers of the Imperial Guard and a group of young administrators. Addis Ababa was seized, and the Crown Prince was proclaimed emperor. The rebellion was crushed by the loyal regular army, who released the crown prince, and millions of Ethiopians recalled the emperor's words when he was forced to flee from the fascist hordes 31 years ago. "I will reorganize and fight again." Haile Selassie returned from Brazil, and order was quickly restored. The rebel general was hanged in the public marketplace. The crown prince escaped punishment, as the moderates maintained that he acted under duress.
Will your son succeed you on the throne, Your Imperial Majesty?
Why you ask me this? If he can't inherit my throne, why I say the parent of the throne of Ethiopia?
Succession to the throne in Ethiopia is inherited as to family, but not necessarily as to individual. The strongest or most astute prince of the family succeeds to the imperial crown. Succession is now limited to one of the royal line of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The emperor has been delegating his ceremonial duties increasingly to his eldest son and heir, Crown Prince Aspa Wasan, who has recently been playing a more important role in public life. The strengthening of the Crown Prince's position is a vital element in Ethiopia's future stability.
Your Imperial Majesty, I'd like to talk about the form of government in Ethiopia.
The form of government we have in Ethiopia is essentially what we have inherited from our forefathers. We have merely established the constitution in order to give it a legal and a firm basis. In order to have a firm democratic basis, you must have education on a wider scale. For that purpose, we have seen to it that educational facilities are expanded throughout the country. We based ourselves on certain fundamental democratic ideologies. These have been practiced by our forefathers. We give legal sanction to it, and this, in the broad aspect, is the general framework of the Ethiopian governmental institution. What the people of Ethiopia need now is to get as much foreign aid as possible, so that the developmental process of the country will be quickened. And once we achieve this, we are going to be in a position to make, with other countries, maximum contribution to the maintenance of international peace and security.
Is there a parliament in Ethiopia, Your Imperial Majesty?
Since I gave the constitution, we have the parliament with all power. We gave the power useful for the parliament.
Would the parliament be very much like the one we have here in Canada, with elected members from all over the country?
We have two chambers in our parliament. One is the Senate, whose members are appointed by the government. The other is the lower house, or House of Representatives, whose members are elected directly by the people. These two bodies work in cooperation, and together they constitute the Parliament of Ethiopia.
There are millions of Christians throughout the world, Your Imperial Majesty, who regard you as the reincarnation of Jesus Christ.
I had heard of that idea. I also met certain Rastafarians. I told them clearly that I am a man, that I am mortal, and that I will be replaced by the oncoming generation.